When our kids were younger and we'd go for a walk in the woods or in the countryside, one of our kids would nearly always, along the way, pick up a really large stick, often probably twice the size of them. And they insisted on carrying it all the way around the walk and taking it back in the car and bringing it home. And it became officially or unofficially known as a stick of travels. And this is one of them. And we have quite a few. And it's amazing that the things that you can use a big stick for. I don't know, what are your top 5 uses of a really big stick? I don't know. It could be used for a walking stick, I'm sure. It could be used for many other things, for a frame of a tent, all those different things. But we are continuing to think of the theme of the great adventure. And we've looked at the fact that in our Christian lives, we are called and we are chosen to a life which was never meant to be boring. This Christian life following the pattern of Jesus. That on this adventure, we are called to have and to be companions on the journey, getting alongside people, both those who are younger and less experienced, like mentors or big brothers or like spiritual parents, or looking for those for yourself in order for you to grow. We've also thought that this adventure is a voyage of discovery. And as we get deeper into knowing and experiencing God, following his path and exploring what he has for us, the journey changes us as well. And this morning, I want us to look at a question. And it's a really significant but yet simple question. But it's significant because it was posed by God himself. We actually did look at some of these questions that God poses about 5 or 6 years ago in men's and women's breakfasts. And as I was preparing this week's message for the Great Adventure, I just remembered this. And it centers on this question that God asks Moses at the burning bush that we've heard in our reading from Exodus chapter 4. But let me bring you up to speed with Moses' career. He is born a Hebrew. He's hidden in bulrushes because of the threat of persecution. He's found and brought up in the royal court. He finds out he's a Hebrew. He gets into a scuffle and kills an Egyptian. He flees as a fugitive into the desert. And he eventually reaches a place called Midian, which is a really long way off. He meets and defends Jethro's daughters. Jethro was the priest of Midian. And he marries one of them and settles down into a nomadic shepherd life for 40 years. And then one particular day, he's taking his father-in-law's flock from one side of the desert to the other, to a place called Horeb, a mountain called Horeb. And at this place, he encounters God in the flames of a burning bush. And in this encounter, he is called by God to go to Israel and tell them that he has met with God and that he's going to free them, to go to Pharaoh's presence. Remember, his adopted brother, and he's still a wanted criminal at this point, to go in front of Pharaoh and demand the freedom of thousands of Hebrew slaves. And throughout this, Moses asks lots of questions and it gives loads of excuses and tries to wriggle out of it again and again and again. And one of those questions is, he says, what if they don't believe me? And it's here that God asks this simple and yet disarming question. What's in your hand, Moses? And Moses replies, it's a big stick. It's a staff. Surely the omniscient and all-knowing and all-capable God can tell that I've got a large staff in my hand. It's one of those things that seems so obvious when someone asks you a question. You think, why am I giving this answer? It's very clear. But the point of this question that we're exploring today in the great adventure, ready, willing, able, and equipped. The point is, you see, Moses constantly has doubts that he's the one, that he's got what it takes, that he can do what God wants, that he's ill-equipped and that someone else would fit the bill better. Is that thinking familiar to you as you feel ill-equipped and unable to do some of the things that God maybe asks us to do? But God stops him in his tracks with this deceptively simple question. What's that in your hand? It's a staff. And in the ancient Near East, that's the time and the place of the Old Testament, the staff was a very potent and recognizable symbol. It was a symbol which represented identity, authority, power, and status. We see it in motifs of ancient rulers as they carry staffs and sticks and rods to represent their power. But as strong as these images were, for Moses, his staff, his big stick, was just his everyday work tool. He was a shepherd and had been for 40 years. And at this point in his life, he was settled into a routine. He knew his place in the world, and he had no intention of going back to Egypt. And with his staff, he would herd sheep together. He'd direct their paths and lead them forward. He'd use them to redirect if they started to go off a wandering, as sheep tend to do. He'd discipline them to remind them which direction they should be on. He'd use it to protect his sheep, his flocks from wild animals, and himself from raiders. So many uses, it was almost like a Swiss Army stick. He used this simple stick, this staff, for over 40 years. Yes, he probably replaced it over that time. And I don't know but it reminds me of a scene in the series Only Fools and Horses, where Trigger, kind of a fairly fun character he's a road sweeper. He has this mantra, which is always look after your broom. And he says, I've had the same broom for 20 years. I've replaced the head 3 times and the staff about 4 times. So it was a completely different broom, but he still thought, I've still looked after my broom. It was his tool, and this was Moses' tool. Almost disregarded, part of him, his work, it was nothing special. And to this seemingly insignificant Middle Eastern shepherd, God gives a huge task to stand before the most powerful ruler of the age and demand the freedom of this people to whom were enslaved to him, to gather and galvanize this disparate and desperate and despondent people into a group, into a nation, and lead them into a land of promise. And when he asked God for some help in doing this, God points him to a big stick. What's going on? Well, God says, do what I say with the staff. And Moses obeys. And so he throws the stick onto the ground, and the staff turns into a snake. And that's just the start of the amazing career of this staff. Here are some of the events that unfold, both for this staff and for Moses' brother Aaron's staff as well. The staff turns into a snake before Pharaoh, and it eats up the 2 snakes that Pharaoh's magicians can create as well. With this staff, the staff strikes the Nile and it turns to blood. It summons plagues of frogs, of gnats, of hail, and of locusts. It strikes a rock and produces water. And in chapter 4, verse 20, this simple stick is renamed the staff of God. That's not a bad CV for a big stick, is it? But the thing is, it wasn't just the stick. It wasn't like this was a magic staff akin to Paul Daniels' magic wand. The staff represents something. It represents and symbolizes Moses' capabilities, his skill, his talent, his experience, his history, all of which has been built up over 40 years of being a shepherd in obscurity, and is represented and summed up by this staff. It's interesting to note that in chapter 3, verse 1, it says that Moses was tending his father's flock, and he led them to the far side of the wilderness, from one side to the other, and they came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Moses had led a flock of probably unruly sheep across the expansive desert from one side to the other, and ended up at the foot of Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the place he was standing now before God. And what was God's ultimate task for Moses? To lead people across the very same desert, from the slavery of Egypt on one side to the freedom of Sinai on the other, where he now stood. And without him even being aware of it, God had been preparing Moses for years for what he was about to do, for what he'd been called to do. And this isn't an isolated case. Fast forward events to 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we see in this situation a large giant of a warrior called Goliath, representing the Philistines, threatening Israel. And the only person willing to face this giant was a young boy, a shepherd again, but a boy who had experienced fighting wild animals, protecting the sheep that were entrusted to him, but also trusting in the protection and provision of God. This had been the preparation that David needed for the encounter with Goliath and for ultimately being king. And was David aware of this preparation while looking after the sheep in the hills around him? Probably not. Just like Moses wouldn't have been. You can almost imagine David is just recovering from a fierce encounter with a wild animal. And as he's panting and sweat and scars over him, defeating the animal, in a dreamy moment, he looks off into the middle distance and he thinks, this is getting me ready one day to fight a giant and to be a king. Of course he wasn't thinking that. He didn't know what was ahead of him, but God did. And God was preparing him even in this place of obscurity. And without realizing it, David and Moses had built up years of training, skill, experience that God wanted and could and would use to achieve something significant for his purposes, something that neither of them could have ever imagined. And all those times that Moses had learned to corral sheep, find good pasture and safety for them, and protect his charge, God had been preparing him. But Moses took for granted what he had in his hand, what he had at his disposal. And I wonder if we often do that too. God asks him, what's in your hand? Just a staff? David, just a few stones and a bit of leather for a sling? Maybe to a young boy, just a few loaves whenever there's 5,000 people to feed, but there's Jesus over there in the corner. You see, I believe that we are called to this great adventure. But are we ready, willing, able, and equipped for it? Or do we think we need to go out and get the theological and missional equivalent of the entire contents of Millets and Cotswold Outdoors before we're ready to go on this adventure? Actually, God says, come with me, even now, just as you are. I love the survival antics of Bear Grylls. I know many of you know this, but one of his basic ideas is that when you're in the wilderness, whenever you're in a survival situation, you use what you've got. And he has come up with some really wild and wacky uses for the most normal of items that we carry around with us. And his question, which is similar to what God is asking here, what have you got? What have you got to offer? What have you got that could be used? And I believe that is the question posed to us by the Lord this morning with regard to this great adventure that he calls us to. The Lord is asking you and he's asking me, what's in your hand? What have you got to offer? See, what you've got, what's in your hand, you may have disregarded as of no use to God. Too normal, too insignificant, not good enough. Because I sincerely believe that every single one of us has something to offer. I believe that each one of us is someone to offer to God. We all have natural, God-given abilities and attributes, personalities and potentials. We have experience, both positive and negative, that God can redeem and use to bless and to help others. But perhaps you presume you don't have something worthwhile. Well, a number of years ago, I was part of a mission team whenever I was a teenager in a place called Lurgan. And at this place, there was a girl there who just didn't think that she had anything to offer. She saw the people who were preaching on the stage. She saw the people who were singing, who were acting, who were leading prayers, who were engaged in evangelism. And she said, I can't do any of that stuff. And one night we found her sat in the kitchen just crying her eyes out, feeling that she had nothing to offer. And what we said to her is, you get alongside all of us. You notice when any of us are feeling a bit down. You have the right words to say. You get alongside us. You comfort us. You encourage us. You pray for us. And she had no idea that that's what she brought. The thing is, you have something to offer to God and to others, but you may not even notice it. So maybe we need to turn the question back to God and say, God, what have I got in my hands? What have you given me to use? Maybe we need to ask our close friends, what do you think I've got in my hands? They may notice it before we do. Because you have something. You are someone to offer. You've got an ability, a blessing, a part of your personality, an experience to share, an insight that you've learned, or an attitude that's natural or developed. But you can only give what you've got and no more. So don't be looking around at other people and expectations if you've not got it. Just bring what you've got, because you'd be surprised how God wants to use it. It may seem to you so normal, only a stick. But a stick in the hand of God, as we have seen, can do some pretty amazing things. A shepherd can challenge a tyrant and lead a people. Another can be a king. A fisherman can lead a movement. An academic can plant churches across the Mediterranean. And an insignificant teenage girl can give birth to a king. You see, a stick in the hands of God can do some pretty amazing things. So discover, recover, admit, revisit, find your God-designed giftings and attributes, because God knows already what you've got. As much as he knew that Moses was standing there with a staff in his hand, he knows what you've got. And what you've got right now might not seem like much. It might be that you're absolutely frazzled, especially with the season we've been through. And all I've got, God, is this small portion. And he says, that's what I'm asking for. Whatever you've got. Maybe we're at maximum output. Find out what God is asking you to do, asking you to offer, because it shouldn't be more than you can handle. What is God asking you to give? What's in your hand? You see, all Moses needed to do was, in obedience and at God's prompting, was to throw the stick on the ground before God, to use what he had. And what that represented for the adventure God called him to offer what he had to God in obedience, to use it the way God directed. What's in your hand? Because you, what you are and who you are, the life you have, and are all really significant in God's hands, even if you think it seems pretty normal. You are already equipped to go on this adventure. But are we willing to throw down our sticks and follow where he leads us? A few questions for you to think about. What are your strengths, your abilities, your personality traits, your skills and your passions and your experiences that you could share? Maybe do one of these online skills finders, strength finders, gift finders. They're quite useful. Do you think we and our experiences can be of use to God and be a blessing and help to others? In what way? What way have they been to you from other people? What stops us throwing our stick, our staff, onto the ground for God to use? What stops us doing that? And do you notice the sticks, the staffs in other people's hands? And have you encouraged them with what they've got? Because they may completely rule out what they've got. And they may need the encouragement to be told, you've actually got this to offer.